Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Katherine McKinley. We recently met at a conference on arts and theology and embodiment, and it was quite an interesting couple of days. I know you enjoyed it. That's probably as much as I did. So welcome, Katherine. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to these days.
Yes, thank you so much, Ed. Thanks so much for this conversation. And we had a very brief introduction. You're very interesting because I am a freelance journalist and I'm currently completing my Master's of Journalism with Harvard University. And as part of that, the reason I was at the Art Symposium is because I'm doing my final capstone project. And in journalism, that means we identify a topic and then we go and we do journalism. We get out there and interview, we research, and we frame up five different articles. And so my topic is connection. And if I was going to give you one sentence, it's basically this whole concept of right now, we seem to be more connected than ever. And yet people feel more disconnected, whether that's, just their own mind, body, soul connection or connection with their neighbors or community, or even, connection with the the spiritual realm. So that was, the reason I was at the symposium, and the reason I was very intrigued with you that led to your kind invitation today was when we met, you introduced yourself and then you said, I'm a connector. And I thought, oh, what does that mean? And so here we are. And I would love to talk about that today.
So, um, the word connection seems to be carrying a lot of different connotations today. So I'm curious as to how you see. Let me be more straight and say it this way. I see connections that we have on, say, social media, and we know who each other are, and we know each other's name. We may like each, put a like, or we befriend them, or somehow we have made a connection. But that's not the same thing as starting a relationship. So I'm curious as to how you see those two things, because they're very close to one another in a certain sense, but the context is really what makes them different, I guess, maybe.
Absolutely. Because you can take technology, for example. So everybody's online, everybody's instantly, air quotes, connected. However, what's the quality of those connections? A quantity of technological connections is not the same as a quality human connection. And it has led to, last year in 2023, the US Surgeon General issued a report and called it the loneliness epidemic, where
Mm-hmm.
people are literally, you can have 10,000 followers on social media, and yet these people are utterly lonely and
Mm-hmm.
isolated and disconnected. So, does that answer your question? And then I would love your thoughts because when I looked through, the material online, doing some background for today's interview, and just the way you introduced yourself, the three words that came up when I look at all of that was a connector, a person who tries for meaningful connections with people. These aren't superficial. uh, you know, Networking or network, which can also be a word of negative connotation, but you got a different take on it, I think. And the third one was community. So you tell me, Ed, what are those to you?
I'm glad you're on here. And I love to engage with people who ask questions. And so thank you. And I think that's one of the ways we connect with one another is we ask questions. And I find that people don't really know how to ask questions, and they need to learn how to ask questions. And I think part of it is that they don't want to embarrass themselves, or they just they're un they're not used to asking questions that lead to a conversation that is really interesting. I mean, this is what the Eddie Network podcast is all about: is having a conversation with someone for the first time where there's some depth to it and some meaning, and we learn something from one another and say, "Oh, that was really great. I want to talk with her again. Let's do this together." And you're in Charlotte, and I'm in Winston Salem, so maybe the next time we actually do that in a coffee shop, and we have coffee together, and then we you see that kind of encompasses what I see. We have the opportunity to connect, touch base, learn a little bit about one another, and then we decide, well, do I want to take this to another level? Do I want to go further? And that going further is really just starting a relationship. And and
So
that I think that well, go ahead.
can I ask you a question? Because you brought something up there about questions. Going through your these first conversations you have, and you introduce that by saying, "I asked the question when I meet somebody, who do you know that I should know?" And then you have these first conversations.
Hmm.
So tell me more about that because you just mentioned that again about asking a question to initiate a connection.
Well, this goes back a long ways.
How did that come about?
Goes back a long way to I don't remember. I've always asked people. Um, I've always asked people about other people. I mean, but but when it became like a tactic, strategy, was when our family moved from West Virginia to Western North Carolina in the mid 90s. And there were three guys in West Virginia where I lived who said, "Well, I know a guy in Asheville that I think you ought to get to know." And I said, "Okay." And three of these and these three guys, they may or may not have known each other, introduced me to three other guys that may or may not have known each other. So I call them up, call these three guys in Asheville up, and I say, "So and so says that I'm new in town, and so and so says I need to get to know you. Can I come by and see you? Tell you about what I'm interested in doing?" He said, "Of course, of course. I mean, you're not going to turn down your friend's introduction."
Mhm.
So I go and see these people and say, "Yeah, this is what I'm interested in. I'm starting a consulting practice. I've never been a consultant, never run a business, but I know how to solve problems. I know how to talk to people. And so, who do you know that you think I should know? Because um, you think that what I am talking about is something that they would be interested in, something like that." And each one of these guys gave me between 10 and 15 names and phone numbers.
Wow.
And I called all those people. It's about 30, 35 people. And I just continued to do that. And it wasn't, I just kind of found this thing. But the more I thought about it, what's important is when you are introducing someone to another person that you know, you're saying my credibility is on the line with the third person because I'm going to introduce you to someone that I think. Um, and so that's important to know. But the person that's being introduced is also saying, well, this person number three is really important because my friend is saying I really need to get to know him. So there becomes this triad of connections which really matter. And I think this is how genuine networks of relationships form. And and so if let's say one, two, and three, person one introduces person two to person three, the relationship that person two and person three have with one another is not going to be like the relationship that one and two have with each other or one and three have with each other. It's going to be a totally different thing because what brings them together and gives them the opportunity to know one another is something that they have to mutually figure out on their own. Does that make
That
sense?
makes that does make sense. That's just what I was going to say. That makes a lot of sense. And I like this quote from a recent interview you did with Mark McEwen. And he said, if I can just read that for just
Sure.
a moment, he wrote you a letter that he wanted you to include, and you read part of it. And he said, you gave us the opportunity to introduce ourselves. You offered us space on your platform. You met us. You offered to meet us with friendship without an agenda. And I feel that's so important in our world. It promotes human interaction and a sense of community. And as I went through again, Ed, your online presence, you really focus on this sense of community. You've got the global impact network, you have circle of impact, you talk about it throughout. So explain that to me because it seems to be very fundamental to all your interactions in your work.
Well, one of the one of the I don't know insight or whatever you want to call it. One of the insights that I had early on when the social media thing began was that um, this is connecting a lot of people together, but it's not connecting them together meaningfully. They're only connected because they're watching the same thing. It's like going to a concert, going to a Taylor Swift concert, and everybody has that experience, but it doesn't really do anything to the relationship unless there's something that the individuals decide they want to have come out of that experience, that shared experience. And I've known fathers who have taken their daughters to a Taylor Swift concert, and it has had it's a binding experience for them. It bonds them together, and it'll be something that they'll talk about the rest of their lives. And so, but you see, that's a very intentional thing that's happening. And what I discovered um, in the last decade, and really just in the first 6 years of the last decade, I traveled considerably, uh, and I made 3 trips to Europe, been to Africa, been to Asia. Um, I think I think 15 countries maybe that I've been to, 16 countries. And what I was in some of those on some of those trips, I would intentionally go and meet people that I'd met online,
Okay.
and I'd go and spend a couple of days with them. And I'm finding out very different things about them, who they are, than the person that they present themselves being online. Now, I'm not saying one is authentic and one is inauthentic. I'm just saying the authenticity grows when you're physically present with someone,
Hmm.
and that's really important. The Global Impact Network was not really about my network. It really was to help people, particularly in developing countries, develop their own networks, and to help them, uh, say in particular, if you're say running an organization in Uganda or Kenya or Tanzania or someplace like that, not in Africa, the tendency is to look to Americans or look to Europeans for money and resources and support. And
Hmm.
and I'm telling them, no, that's not your future. We're not your future. The future is right there where you live. And you need to build the relationships where if you need to raise money, together you will raise the money.
Interesting. So go local. Don't be looking. You've got a bird in hand. You just might not know it yet.
That's right. So
So do you have examples of that you could share?
it's a very difficult thing to convince people who have been conditioned to look to the West for money to say, I'm not going to give you any money. I
Hmm.
believe that your African organization should have African leadership and it be
Hmm.
supported with African money.
Okay, so that's a challenge is to
That's the
overcome that
challenge to
mindset.
them, and that's why the Global Impact Network exists. And it was born out of the need of some people in Uganda during the first year of the the pandemic who were all dealing with orphans in particular, but also poor people, and they needed to come together and be able to talk about, well, how are we going to do this? And what I find is that there's, if you go into the communities, you see people working together, but you
Hmm.
go take these organizations that get created and they're not working together. And so, I was pushing against this notion that I can be an independent person and I can run my own thing. And as long as I can get funding from an American or some person like that, then I'll be okay. And that's really not a sound business mindset today, because things are changing so much.
Hmm.
And I mean, and I guess the other thing to say is that um, 70% of Africans are under the age of 30. So there's an opportunity there to develop leadership and develop those networks with young people, and figure out how they're going to do that. How are we going to work together? How do we build our nation from the lowest level, the
Hmm.
ground up, from the small local community? How do we build the strength that allows us to take care of ourselves? And when I was there in February in Kenya in February of 2020, I interviewed some women who were being trained to be farmers.
Okay.
And I interviewed, and it's episode one of the Eddie Network podcast. And and the and what we talked about, I'm talking too much here, but what we talked about was how they can be self-sufficient and interdependent. And I'm listening to them and I'm saying, we need you to come to America and teach us this.
Teach us what?
Self-sufficiency
Okay.
and interdependence.
Okay. Have you talked to them since? How did that play out?
Well, I talked to the leaders of the organization. Oh yeah,
Right.
they're doing well. It's about 46 women that were in the program. This is back in 2020, that they had started in 2019. So they're through the program, and they're raising chickens and dairy cows and growing
Wow.
vegetables, and probably at this point, 5 years later, almost 5 years later, they are growing trees.
Wow. So, but it was again, like you say, you had to make some connections in
Yeah,
order to build that. They
right.
needed connections to be self-sufficient.
Yeah. Well,
Is that fair?
yeah, it's entirely, absolutely fair, because the connection, um, we have to recognize that this connection that we're having is a human connection when we both have needs, and we if we want to be independent, that's fine, but we will find that our lives are not as flourishing as they could be if we actually decided to work together, build relationships.
Thank you. So let's trigger off that word relationships because I like to bring in your circle of impact. So that talks about relationships, idea, and structure.
Yeah,
Can you just give a general overview of what that
certainly.
framework is?
That model is a product of observation. And what I saw in observing people in my first years as a consultant were three patterns of behavior. There's the three patterns of behavior are a lack of clarity about our ideas, who we are, what we believe in, what are our values, a lack of respect and trust within the relationship within the organization, and a lack of clarity about how does the structure that we're operating in affect us. And what I found was the structure dominates and marginalizes ideas and marginalizes relationships. So the circle of impact is actually a holistic thing, and you want to have all three of these operating in a kind of a dynamic tension. And if that doesn't make sense, then you say, well, let's talk about a problem you may have. So what kind of problem is this? Is it an idea problem, a relationship problem, or a structure problem? And whichever it is, you decide which one it is. The other two become the resources for solving it.
Oh, intriguing. Okay. So the structure can be limiting or liberating,
It can be, yeah.
right? And then same with the ideas. Like you said, they can be beliefs a person has. I'm a painter or I'm an accountant, and maybe they're not. So let's unpack that a little bit because that's a bit of an internal connection. I'm disconnected from what I believe or who I am. So draw that out for me if you can through some of your, interactions with people. I mean, how do you approach that if you see it in one of your clients or one of your connections? That
Well,
fundamental.
let me ask you the questions that I would be asking you in return. So you have decided to be a freelance journalist,
Mhm.
and when at what point in your life did you decide to become that?
Sure. So my story is I'm a technology person. I'm actually an engineer. I was very defined by my structure, and my structure gave me tremendous opportunity and relationships. But that imploded when the internet bubble imploded, and for so many of us. And I went into banking and finance. Significant event last year that caused me to reevaluate what brought me joy in my day. And I came to the realization had a wonderful job, worked for a wonderful company, wonderful people, no complaints. Everything on the outside was fine. But I had started taking these classes for the masters, and that came about very in a, serendipitous kind of backwards way. I noticed at work that things that had worked before were no longer working or didn't seem to be. I was no longer in leadership, organizational leadership positions, and communications, people just didn't seem to understand what I was saying. And I'm like, hmm. So I looked for a master's of communications and I found this program at Harvard. And I'm like, Harvard, a master of journalism? Huh. I don't know what that, but they had these business communications and digital communications, and they have a phenomenal online program for folks like me who are not in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I started down that path. And as this event happened last year, I realized I spent, 12, 14 hours a day working at something that no longer gave me any joy or satisfaction. I did it. I did it well. That's just professional good ethics. But I would just wait until I could get home and do my assignments for class and come alive and have joy. So
Mhm.
then at the end of last year, I just said, like you're always going to be waiting. You're taking one class a semester, you'll graduate in 2028 if you live that long. And, what are you doing? Maybe it's a career change. Be brave. So I left my very good corporate job last year as a single parent, no other source of income. And it took me months to struggle with that. And I still kick myself at times, that was a bad decision. People would have loved your life. What are you doing? Just do it till you retire and then you can do something fun. So that's how I came about to it, Ed. I took these classes. I was all in. I totally overloaded my semesters to get through the masters this year. And I love those classes. And I honestly can't even tell you how I've gotten through them. It's all brand new. It's way over my head. And I love it. Like this conversation we're having. I love it. That was a pretty long-winded answer.
No, it didn't. No, that was a great answer. I love that because what you're representing is something that I've seen in a lot of people, which is that at some point midlife, they recognize, why am I doing this? I'm going to do something else. And so they make a change. And I mean, I didn't see this 30, 40 years ago because I was not in position to see it, even though I went through the same thing when I was 42. I became a consultant when I was 42. But what I see is that people are recognizing that they have many more dimensions to who they are. And when those things begin to emerge later in life, it does bring joy. And it means that, oh, and my way of describing that is that we entered the third half of life.
Oh, the third half of life. Okay. Unpack that a bit more for me. And also unpack, if you don't mind, your journey, because you do have an unusual one.
Yeah, well, I'll describe it this way. First half was school, first years of work. And to a large extent, that's exploratory. For me, it was exploratory. I mean, I went off to UNC Chapel Hill and became an American Studies major because I found everything there. All the other options were too narrow. I wasn't well suited. I wasn't really well suited to be a college student, but I survived. Went off to, and then I did. What am I going to do? Well, I had experience doing ministry. So I did high school ministry for a couple of years, then went off to seminary and became an ordained Presbyterian minister, but never feeling that this was the thing. And then when I was in my early 30s, I discovered that leadership was my calling. And I began to study it, began to realize I disagreed with almost everything I was studying. And so it meant that I had to expand my perception of what leadership is, understand how organizations function, all those sort of things, and ultimately led to the creation of the Circle of Impact, and then being a consultant for almost 20 years, and realizing that as well suited as I was for that, I wasn't very good at it because I had too high expectations for change. And
Oh,
and
what does
but
that mean?
well, that means that if you have
Change
a
in you
problem,
or oh,
no, with the client
oh.
or with the church that was served. If it's clear that there's a problem here, we're going to solve the problem. We're going to move on, and that creates change. And the fact that people would intentionally choose to live with their problem rather than to change their problem was really problematic to me. So I've been in a constant state of transition throughout my whole life, and kind of narrow this whole thing down. So in the early 2000 teens, I went through three losses. Basically, the recession killed off my consulting practice, even though I had it but it never came back to what it once was. I took on a nonprofit, executive director of a nonprofit, and within 18 months, I was fired from that.
Oh.
That's all right. It wasn't my fault. When your board will not give money, then you know that there's a flaw in the system. And then went through the end of my marriage. So in 2014, I was totally free of all these obligations from the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was starting over. I literally was sitting in my apartment in Asheville, and I thought, if I'm going to do anything with the rest of my life, I have to move. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to move to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I mean, that was the next thought. Literally, the next thought was, I'm going to move to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Following week,
Why?
well, because I've been there and I loved it. I loved
Oh,
it. Yellowstone is my favorite place in the world. I mean, it's all those things. And
uh-huh.
the following week, I was out there and I found a condo and I put an offer on it. And by February, I was moving into life in Jackson Hole
Wow.
without a plan for what I was going to do.
Okay.
And so what ended up happening was became clear that I needed to write the book, The Circle of Impact, and I spent 2016 to 2018 producing the book, and then late 2018 through 2019 selling it, going doing book events all over the country. And then it became, and so this is, and that was, so from 1984 to 2019, that was the second half of my life.
Okay.
That's the leadership dominant time of my life. And then it
Okay.
was clear, okay, it's time to make a change. That this chapter is over. I woke
Hmm.
up in the middle of the night. I realized this chapter is over. Okay, God, what do you want me to do?
Hmm.
And it's still not clear. Here we are, 5 years later. It's okay. It's all right. It doesn't have to be clear. You just have to take what's in front of you. So it's how I end up going to Africa to do training, how I, um, met all kinds of different people, how I ended up leaving Jackson during the first year of the pandemic and moving back to North Carolina, and how here, as of this year, moving in back to my hometown of Winston-Salem after being gone for 53 years.
Wow. So that's interesting. What does that feel like? Why did that happen?
The simple answer is it's the only place I found a house to buy.
Well, that's fair.
And now that's a simple answer, but it doesn't really answer why I'm here. And I'm still trying to figure that out. But it's good to be back. I'm seeing lots of people I knew when I was a child, and
Wow.
those relationships still are very solid. And but I'm meeting a lot of new people, and it's clear that I have a role to play here, but it's not clear what that role is.
Interesting.
And
How long have you been there now, Ed?
since February, so
February of this year.
yeah,
Oh, okay. Wow.
and and but the clear thing is that what we're doing here, this is really the best work that I've ever done. This is what I should be doing, and the question is how do I take this
Hmm.
and develop it so it grows?
Hmm.
And for some that means how do you go chase the numbers?
Mm.
And to me, it's how do I use this as a vehicle for building relationships where those relationships have an opportunity. The person who is in relationship has the opportunity to grow in their sense of what is possible as a person of impact.
Well, and perhaps our conversation will trigger a bit because you do have a great sense of empathy and connection and creating human connection. I mean, we met very briefly, but I instantly was like, oh, this is a warm person, level. Yeah, I would definitely like to, have this person in my professional network. And so you definitely have a gifting and a skill in that area of connection.
Thank you.
And yeah, it would be interesting to see how that plays out because people are more isolated and disconnected than ever.
Well,
They don't even know how to have a conversation anymore.
I think the key, Catherine, is most of these introductory conversations we have with people. Like you go to a business after hours event, you know, most of those questions are about me telling you who I am.
Hmm.
It's not about me asking who you are, who are you, and oh, you're a journalist. Oh, that's fascinating. Come on the podcast so we can have a conversation about this. That's really all it takes. And and so if people were to take that kind of curiosity into their meetings of people, then I think it could change their life. But I think that there's a fear. There's a fear to that. There's a reticence to that. There's a there are all these obstacles that people have to overcome in order to get to that simple place of, so who are you and why are you important? And well, I'm not important. Yes, you are. I mean, let me just give you one example. So I'm a month into living here, and I'm sitting in a bar downtown watching the NCAA basketball tournament. This guy walks in, sits down next to me. We're at the
Hmm.
bar, and we start talking. It's clear that he's kind of a corporate guy, and that's fine. I like corporate guys. And so we're talking and he says, so what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a writer. I'm a leadership guy. I'm a writer and I have a podcast. He said, oh, well, tell me about your podcast. And I said, well, uh, I just, I just like talking to people and I invite them to come on and introduce me to people that they come on and he says, well, I mean, what kind of people? And I turn in my seat and I wave my hand over the entire room. It's packed with people. And it says, every person in this bar would be an ideal guest on the podcast. He says,
And
why?
what did he say to that?
Why? He says, because every one of these people has something to contribute, some thought, some experience, something about who they are is worth sharing. And my job as the host is to find a way to bring that out of them so that they feel like I've been heard, I've been seen, I've been appreciated.
I think you've called out a few of those things really well, Ed, that you're talking right now about you being curious. You're curious about other people, and
Yeah.
that prompts the conversation and the connection because they feel heard or valued, or somebody asked me a question, they seem genuinely interested.
Yeah.
And then you called out the authenticity, which is another one, especially you reference, going to a business networking event. Everybody's like, yeah, sure, here. And there's no authenticity behind it. It's just superficial. So how do you make that authentic connection? You know what? We've talked about curiosity, we've talked about conversation. Is there anything else that makes it authentic or that you do?
I just think that you can't approach people as if there's something you're going to take from them.
Mhm.
You approach people with the sense that they have something to contribute to the wider world. I mean, I believe that's, see, I'm really curious about what you're going to do with this journalism degree. You're a
Mhm.
freelance journalist, but that just tells me sort of the mechanics of what you do.
Mhm.
Why are you a freelance journalist? And do you have areas, categories, places, things that actually intrigue you that you want to focus on specifically?
Mhm.
What I mean, why? Why? I know why you're doing it. That's not the good, but where are you going to take this?
That's a great question. And I'll answer that. I just want to summarize what you said about
Hmm.
don't approach people to take. I think when I hear how you approach people, and even when we met, you look to give rather than get from that initial connection. Is that a fair
True.
summary?
It's very true.
Okay, very good. Awesome. So where do I want to go with journalism? So, I mentioned the bringing joy. I used to love writing when I was a kid, very creative and it was a real strength. And I just kind of buried that as I got buried with science and then work and life and raising kids. And you just become a automaton, and again, it wasn't bad. Those are things that served for the time. I mean, I wouldn't change anything about my career path to now. And there's absolutely no, nothing like, oh, I hated that job. No, I had wonderful opportunities. But that chapter, like you said earlier, has changed. It just simply has changed. I think that's the biggest piece is giving ourselves permission to say, yeah, it's okay. Change, something new, cool. Why journalism? Because I found as I took those classes that my soul came alive. Like, yeah, I'm learning new things. I'm communicating. I'm creating something that could change somebody's day or life for the better. So, for an example, my journalism class. Oh, yeah. So, in my very first journalism class, it's the introductory kind of, dip your feet in the water. And this woman, 30, 40 years she's been a journalist. She's still an active one, an editor, and phenomenal. person to be the entry to journalism because she took people under her wing and she just coaches you and she guides you. Anyways, in her class, we had an assignment to go y- just find some reporter um, or current writer and do a profile on them. So how I can't the connections to find somebody, it's amazing to me. And I found this person in Raleigh. His name is Joe Neff, and he's been an investigative reporter for years. And, just an amazing person. And I was so impressed with his dedication, and he focused on the truth of the matter. Let's get to the facts. And it didn't matter like, oh, in this particular case, he was investigating somebody who was on death row, and that it seemed like maybe he shouldn't be there. And he went and he did his due diligence. And, I just never forget him saying things like, it doesn't matter that the guy's a bad guy, or we'd be like, oh, he must have done it. He said, I want to find out, did he really do this? Is he supposed to be on death row for this? Was justice carried out? Did everybody do their? And they hadn't. And as a result of the series that he ran in the News and Observer um, in Raleigh, uh, there's actually a legislative change to policy, so that the defense had to release, or sorry, the prosecutor had to release the full defense information, which they had not. And if they had, he would not have gone to death row. And in fact, it was overturned and he was released. And I looked at that, Ed, and I thought, how amazing would that be to have that kind of an impact? I'm in my comfortable corporate job doing a good work, professional, hardworking. I'm sure I'm helping somebody, but that kind of an impact.
Yeah.
So that really got me onto this. Now, you ask, where am I going? I actually don't know either. I know I love it, and I'm almost at the end of it. And we'll see. I'm applying to all kinds of jobs, but you know, I don't know. Did that answer your question about the
Yeah, it's
journalism?
it's, it's really fascinating because what I hear you saying is that this is a field that's less about the writing and more of the
The
discovery of the
the
story.
change, like meaningfully finding out the facts of the matter. And
Yeah,
that's not my opinion. My opinion is I need to go find out. Like getting ready for this interview, I'm like, this is so much fun. See who he is. Let's see what he does. I'm
I'm
gathering
impressed with
information.
I'm impressed with your preliminary work.
But as journalists are curious people.
Yeah,
And that's why they uncover these stories because you go in and you're not giving your opinion. You're trying to find out what's going on.
I'm going to introduce you to a couple of people once we're done because I think you'll find that there are things that engaged with that are going to be intriguing to you, and you actually want to know these two women. I'll tell you about that later. But
I would love it.
see, this is another facet of what we're talking about. So you and I have connected. We connected at a conference. We shared some interest with what was going on at the conference. Um, and now here you are on my podcast, and we're talking about your life as a journalist, and I'm talking about my life as a leadership guy and a podcaster. But there's something more that happens, and that is the recognition that I can take my life at whatever age I am and change it to become a person of impact. I can make a difference that matters. And the question is not the question is, well, what does that mean? The question is, how can I do that today? And then how can I do that tomorrow and the next day and the next day? Because I think what you will find is that you really are freer than you've ever been in your life. You're free to go discover and create create change.
Very fun. It sounds exciting. So tell me then, because you said you're in your third stage of life, and but then you don't quite have it sorted out either. So how do you see your path going forward? Are you just going to keep on this journey of transition and change, or what does that look like?
I am hoping that this is my last move, but I don't take that very seriously. I don't think that I've reached my final destination. I do tell you what I think. Um, I've learned things about myself in the last couple of years that um, I'm surprised I didn't know prior to this, and it's changed the way I look at myself and look at what are my options. And this is why these introductions, why these making connections that are more than superficial really matter. So the month before I started the podcast last year, I was contacted by Barbara Cleve, who's a polymath coach in Switzerland. She's a physician and a polymath coach. And she says, I think you're a polymath. I said, what? You know, and and so she invited me to join this group that meets every other Thursday. And I realized that I was, after some thought and some pursuit of the thoughts about that, I realized, okay, I have this very broad perspective of the world, and if you, I'm in the struggle to open up all my boxes of books and put them into bookshelves, and although that is not because I'm interested in topics in a analytical sense, I'm interested in topics because they provide me an entree into talking to people who are really, really interesting. And to be able to talk to people who are very smart is really interesting to me because I find that they typically are not understood well. And
What
so,
does that term mean? I'm sorry. Polymath?
polymath,
Polymath?
it
Oh,
just means
polymath.
many learnings.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's a person. I mean, traditionally in the past, it was typically applied to someone that would have gotten three PhDs in three different disciplines.
Got it. Okay.
Well, I'm not that person. I wasn't that great a student. Partly because of the other thing that I've discovered, and that is that I'm neurodivergent
Mm,
because I don't think like everybody. I, I,
hmm.
I see the big picture. I mean, and so as a consultant, I could go sit in a meeting and almost I know what was going on. I could see it all. I could see all the interplays going on, and it wasn't an analytical understanding of it. It was really much more an embodied sense of or intuitive sense of what's happening. And so
Right.
what I've learned, and I've learned because I've been interviewing people who are also like this. Oh, so yeah, that makes sense. That's why I may be included, but never fit in.
Oh, it may be included, but I never fit in. What a great statement. I bet that's a lot of people.
So where this goes is I'm going to write more and I'm going to do podcasting, and I will do this as long as I can.
So
And
then, yeah, go ahead, Ned.
well,
Sorry.
it's just because it's what I love.
I like that. So then, maybe just because I know we're coming to the end of our time. So then, just to circle back where we began, was that art symposium. So, what was your interest in going to that?
Um, going through seminary, you study theology, and theology is sort of biblical philosophy. It takes up very philosophical framework, like ancient philosophy or modern philosophy or postmodern, but it's using ancient biblical theology and stuff like that. So it's a different world. It's the church's world of philosophy, and to a large extent, it has nothing to do with what goes on in the academic halls of academic philosophy departments.
Okay.
And yet they're talking about similar things. And the thing that's similar was the fact that they sold this conference as um, embodied faith through the art of Edward Nippers. Embodied faith means that faith is something different than simply ideas that of belief. It's actually something that inhabits your body. And if you go leave the theological world and go over here to the secular philosophy world, that's where the world of phenomenologists that emerged in the middle of the 20th century have come, and it's really focused on how our how we know things because of our bodily experience, our sensory experience. So I'm putting these two together, and and um, and that's really that's why I end up that's why I went, and it was fantastic.
Right.
And what I found was that these two worlds are not talking to each other, and they need to be talking to each other. And I may be the person to have to bring that conversation together.
And those two worlds, you mean art and faith.
I'm talking about faith and secular philosophy.
Okay.
The faith and the sacred and the secular are are separate, and they don't understand one another. And I've lived in those two worlds. Um, I've been embodied in those two worlds for the last 50 years. So the third half of my life is going to be taken up with, I think, bringing these two together. It sounds like there's a program, it's a plan. There is no plan. It's just that I'm going to sort a way to bring this together and talk, be able to talk with people about it.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Oh, where's the slide with the three bullet points? It sounds like it's a very solid plan. Do you have any ideas? How like what is the big challenge to that? Why is there that great divide?
The big challenge is there's twofold. It's twofold. One is defining reality, and so if reality is simply a perception, then we are not embodied people. But if reality is something that exists and that we experience it, then how do we experience it and how do we understand it? And so that's part of the question. Then the other side of that is how do we live in a world of high technology where you have artificial intelligence defining in many ways what is true, but it's in many respects simply defining what was true in the past, but not as what will be true in the future. So I think
Wow.
there's a lot of interesting things. So
Well,
there are
that
a couple
sounds
of
like it.
books. There are a couple of books there,
I was going to say, it sounds like I'm going to have to stay tuned and find out where all that goes.
but but it sounds to me like you. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like to me that you're about to embark on a writing career that's beyond simply being a freelance journalist. But there's more to this. It's going to crack open some kind of Fabergé egg, and this beautiful thing's going to emerge where your writing will take on a flourish that will be very significant in the world.
I love. I'm going to keep that vision. Thank you so much. And thank you for all of this, Ed. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we met.
So when you write your first book, I want you to come back on the podcast and talk about it.
I did. I just released my book on 9/22.
Tell me about it.
It's called Possible, Memoir of an Unexpected Life. It's under 100 pages on. And yeah, it was as the result of that event last year. And, one of those events, you just look at your life and go, what just happened? Why did that happen? What does it mean for my life going forward?
So where do we find this book?
It's on Amazon. Mm-hmm.
course.
Yep, Possible. And it's called Possible, Memoir of an Unexpected Life. And I'm the author, Katherine J. McKinley. And yeah, I can pop a link in the chat
Send
for
me
you if
the.
you'd like.
So let me ask you one more question about that.
Hmm.
Um, did you enjoy the process of writing the book?
Oh, that's a double-edged question because it was very stressful at times. And I'm like, would you finish your book? But as a writer, you go back and you're like, I don't think I like how he said that. Then you go back and you rewrite something, you're like, what was I thinking? So that part of it is difficult. I think, like anyone creating anything, you can tell me about your experience writing your book. But at the end of it, I can't even describe how wonderful that felt to say, well, this is a piece of my life. And if it helps somebody, and I've had several people who are like, wow, this powerful story. Can I share it with my friends? Yes, if it'll help somebody and somebody gets value, yes.
I
So
think
I
what,
think it, overall thumbs up, but it was a painful process.
as it should be, it means it's a better work of art. And I think it's worth knowing that having accomplished that, that that actually builds credibility for you. I found that to be true, when I published my first book, and he says, "Oh, well, I felt like it was sort of earning a PhD.
Hmm.
You've gone through the suffering, and now
Hmm.
you're going to be recognized for it." And so, but I'm thinking of you doing some kind of investigative story that you write the book on, and I think
Hmm.
that would be really, because I see you out there writing. I mean, doing the interviews. You could do actually you could do a podcast because you've got that interviewer approach. And
Well,
I have
thank
someone
you.
else I'll introduce you to as well, if that, and we'll talk about that
I
because
love
I think
that.
that you're at a point in your life where it's about to radically change and become beautiful in ways that you never would have imagined.
That sounds amazing. Thank you so much, Ed. Can I pop that in the chat, the link for you of that book? Is that okay?
Sure, sure, that'll
Oh,
be fun.
okay. Okay. But
And
yeah,
I'm glad you came
to be
on.
honest,
Yeah,
I just want to say thank you so much. It's been a delight. I hope we stay connected.
we will, and okay, I have more to say, but let me close this out. Thank you, Catherine, for being with us today. It's been a real treat, and thank you for all your questions. It's been fun, and thank you all for watching. And be sure to hit the like button, sign up, and leave a comment if you will, because we always appreciate hearing from you. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.